But tonight's lecture, of course you all know, it's about Duchess Castle, and it's sponsored tonight by Richard and Robin McLean. We're really thankful that they sponsored this lecture series that allows us to do these presentations. So thank you so much to them. And I will hand the mic over.
It's my pleasure tonight to introduce to you two long-term friends, Kit Ruminer and J.J. Mortensen, and a new friend, Rory Gauthier. Kit and I graduated from high school here not too long ago, so we've known each other for a long time. I met J.J. a little more than a decade ago when she edited the book I wrote on Peggy Pond Church. She did a terrific job, and in the process taught me a great deal about editing and writing, and so I'm very grateful to that. As with many of us, Kit and JJ became curious about two women who once lived in a stone house in a canyon east of here about a century ago. The house became known as Duchess Castle. Who were they, and what led them to make the contributions they did to New Mexico history? These are interesting women, but for so long we didn't know very much about them. But I think you'll decide tonight that we know quite a bit now. Kit and JJ have done some amazing research, and will share that with us, giving us answers for things that we've always wanted to know. I think you will be impressed with the depth of their research. Rory will begin the presentation this evening by setting the stage. He will speak about the archaeology of the area and interpret the history of the ancient ruins near Duchess Castle. He is infinitely qualified to do that in the fact that he participated in the original archaeological survey of the Sanqui unit in 1988, and that's where Duchess Castle is found. And he served as Bandelier's archaeologist for almost 2 decades. So with that bit of background, I don't want to take too long because we want the main deal here. I will now turn it over to the speakers, and they're going to teach us a great deal about Duchess Castle and the women who lived there.
Good evening. I want to thank everybody for showing up tonight. We were supposed to give this actually a week ago, and we happened to snow. I want you to know that snow is forecast later this evening. But that'll give you plenty of time to get home. Excuse me? Of course, tonight's main focus is going to be on Duchess Castle and the people associated with the site. I am going to be giving a broader introduction to the area of Sanqui, of Duchess Castle, and the Pajarito Plateau. So please bear with me. I think most of you are probably familiar with this, and you may have heard this talk before, and for that I do apologize, but you're going to get it again. My co-presenters, JJ and Kit, they did all the heavy lifting on this. And you will see that the amount of research that they did, what they have found out about these rather two remarkable women who are responsible for Duchess Castle, and you will learn something today. And of course, Duchess Castle is located in the Sanqui unit of Bandelier National Monument, and you can see from the
Was it on the left at the top? Looking for the pointer right there.
Technical difficulty.
What's it look like? Got it? This one?
This
Okay.
Everybody recognizes the map of Sanqui Mesa parking area. This is the village of Sanqui. Duchess Castle is located to the north of it in the valley bottom. It's an early representation of the duality that's reflected in Tewa architecture. Duality to summer people, winter people, north side people, south side, and so on. And you see this at all the archaeological sites that are ancestral to San Ildefonso on the Pajarito Plateau. By those I mean Oduy, Navui, Sanqui, and Sirigay. Each one of these big, large, classic period sites has a little neighboring site. In this case, it's Duchess Castle, right there. And it's just fortuitous that that this historic site is later built on the remains of the sister village to Sanqui. Sanqui, the traditions at San Ildefonso Pueblo are very closely tied with the village of Sanqui and the Duchess Castle area. Their traditions mention Sanqui along with Oduy, Navui, and Sirigay. These four villages are all related and they are all ancestral to San Ildefonso. The name, Sanqui Owinge, for this area, roughly translated village at the gap of the sharp round cactus. You can still, this has been pointed out to me, this landform where this name comes from. As you approach Sanqui Mesa, you do come to a narrow area, the gap, the Wee. And there, this was pointed out to me by several gentlemen from San Ildefonso, that this is the place name for this area. It narrows down, and the area, the density of prickly pear cactus there just jumps up. So evidently, at least 400 years ago, more likely 600 years ago, these cacti were growing there at this gap, and that provides the name for Sanqui. But the take-home message for this is just how closely tied San Ildefonso is to Sanqui Mesa. And this tie continues today, and even with the later establishment of Duchess Castle, you'll see how they are tied together. And Kit and JJ will also speak about this closeness with San Ildefonso and Sanqui Mesa. A little bit of history. Bandelier was established February 11, that's correct. 1916, Woodrow Wilson signed it into law, establishing the national monument. And you can see the little, originally 160 acres, just a little postage-sized stamp centered on the mesa of Sanqui. Duchess Castle is just right out, the location is outside the boundary of the original Sanqui unit. One thing to notice from this map is there's no roads. Access originally to get to Sanqui or to Bandelier National Monument, you'd come up Los Alamos Canyon. There's evidently a wagon road that went through where Totavi is now, up past the water towers, and then curved over. Then the other route up was Buckman. It's located approximately here, which would get you over to the Sanqui area. So from 1916, when the area was signed over to the Forest Service, the area was originally managed by the Forest Service until 1932. and then it was transferred to the National Park Service. And that's a big year in the history of Southwest parks, and in particular Bandelier, because that's when Franklin Roosevelt brought in the New Deal policies, which brought the CCC to Bandelier. And that's when the entrance station was constructed, the entrance road, and all the facilities in the main canyon area. And again, that's 1932. There's the Duchess Castle, Sanquois area, you can see is greatly increased in size. It goes from 160 acres to over 5,000 acres. And also it included Odoe in with the Sanquois unit. Now in 2020, excuse me, in 1963, this has changed again. The period from the 1900s up to about 1932, the area was used pretty hard. Woodcutters were running rampant through the area. People were running cows and sheep through the area, and so on. I'll talk a little bit more about this. Anyway, let me change speed here. I need to talk about the settlement. Pueblo people in Bandelier and the Pajarito Plateau. And I have a series of maps here that are based on the number of sites dating to number of rooms, and from that we extrapolated population. The earliest Pueblo settlement on the Pajarito Plateau, as you can see, is clustered. Right here, that's Bandelier, that's right around where the visitor center is now on the mesa tops on both sides. This is developmental period, roughly dating around 1100 to 1150. But one thing to notice about this across the plateau is that it's very sparse except for this one area in Bandelier National Monument. If you look at the Sanquois unit, you see there's absolutely no occupation there. Beginning in 1150 to 1200 in the succeeding period, you can see there's just a tremendous increase in population. This next period, the coalition period, it's short. It's only 125 years or so. But during this period, roughly 1150 to 1325, I could only add, how many years is that? Okay. It's slightly over 125 years. During this period, over 700 little, what we call unit pueblos are established on the Pajarito Plateau. I'm talking about the area from Pouillet down to Quapa, down where Dixon's apple orchard used to be. So 700 villages are established during this time. This coincides with the great migrations coming out the north. You know, the abandonment of the Mesa Verde region, people moving out there, settling on the Pajarito Plateau. And you can see it's reflected by the number of sites. Again, it's a short period, but it's a period of rapid growth, and it's probably where population reaches the maximum on the plateau. The following period, the classic, dating roughly 1325 to 1550 to 1600, what we see is a condensing of population. Population dropped until we have people just moving off the plateau around 1550. This map is for the classic period. That's Pouillet at the north, Quapa in the south. But this area right here, which is the Ramon V. Hill Grant, basically where Los Alamos County is now, reflects Odoe, Sanquois, Nahui, Sirigay. These four major villages during the classic period. And what is unique about these four villages, first of all, their ties to San Ildefonso, but the spacing between them. This has always fascinated me. They are located I think it's 1.25 miles apart. each one of them. You can get out the old USGS maps and scale it off. But one of the sites is misplaced, so that'll throw you off. USGS made a mistake, but if you plot Navui correctly, you'll see that it fits that pattern. So in summation, what we have from the developmental period, small population, rapid population growth in the coalition period. Again, that 700 little villages established during that time period, to the classic period. And then beginning in the 1600s, drastic changes. A few words about what's classic about the Pajarito Plateau. Sanqui, the Duchess Castle, it forms a good model of the archaeology of this region. First of all, we have a big village, Sanqui Village. We've all been up there. You can see there's 200 rooms. This is based on Hewitt's 1906 map, which is remarkably accurate map of Sanqui Mesa. So you have the big village. To the north, I mentioned the little sister village, which is now what we call Duchess Castle, which we also see again that duality at Odawi with Little Odawi, Navui with Navui Longhouse, with Sirigay with an unnamed site, and also with Sanqui and Duchess Castle. That duality, two villages, represent the moiety system that's prevalent in Tewa society is also reflected in the architecture. But we also have kivas, reservoirs, cliff houses. You know, we're all familiar with cavates. Everybody goes to the Sanqui unit. Kids love these things. And then also the trail system. The Park Service loves to interpret the trail system at Sanqui. The guidebooks, we've changed it, but the guidebook used to say, the comings and goings, generations, people walking back and forth have worn these trails into the tough bedrock. And we no longer think that. These are constructed features. As you can see, walking up and down the tuff like that, unless you're holding hands, you wouldn't get those parallel grooves. Wonderful stairways too. And these are all present at Sanqui. Now again, this occupation up on the Pajarito Plateau undergoes a drastic change sometime in the late 1500s. 1582, we know there's a bad drought. They used to call it the worst drought based on tree rings ever recorded. That changed in the 2000s where we read that with the effects of climate change. But in the 1600s, people are moving off the plateau. They're going down to the Rio Grande village, and we all know that story where they settled down there. We only have sporadic use of the Pajarito following that. We have some people going up there, still tending some of the farming fields during the Pueblo Revolt, as indicated by this petroglyph. You see somebody up there documented what we believe was a conquistador. And you could see the oversized horse, the soldier with a sword. As I mentioned earlier, the early 1900s were not kind to Sanqui. That period, again, was established in the Sanqui Duchess Castle area. It was established in 1916, 1932. The Park Service moves in. But during that time, people are pretty much running rampant over that unit. They're harvesting a lot of wood out of this area. They're going up there, hacking away at the junipers for fence posts. Probably a little bit of farming, firewood gathering too. Just about every juniper of any size in any age within the Sanqui unit's been hacked upon. We also have historic grazing. This is a historic photo of Buckman Crossing. And again, if you followed that road up, it would take you up to Sanqui Duchess Castle area, but you can just see the number of sheep coming out of the Pajarito Plateau. And of course, the extensive grazing, the overgrazing that was permitted on the plateau, and on the plateau in the Jemez Mountains led to extreme erosion, but it also changed the fire regime. And I'm sure some of you have heard Craig Allen talk about all that. But another thing that the sheep and the grazing did at the Sanqui unit, shepherds were corralling the sheep up against the cliffs. And the sheep, the action, they were going inside the cavates, and actually they were rubbing up against the cavates. And that had bad effect on, as you can see, on removing the plaster and so on. So the historic period, beginning in the 1600s, was not kind to the resources of Sanqui, but it's also the historic period which leads us to Duchess Castle. Now, Duchess Castle is a very complex archaeological site. You think, well, no, it's a summer house. Some people built a summer house there. Archaeologists, we love to find sites like Duchess Castle. We do. We like them because, first of all, it's complex. It was originally settled during the Coalition period. If you remember that one slide where we had that tremendous increase in population, that's when we get our first settlement at Duchess Castle. And you have to say, well, why? What makes this area so special that everybody that passes through here wants to live here? I think it has something to do with its location in Los Alamos Canyon, and there is a water source just to the north of that, Los Alamos Canyon. I think that probably was more of a good water source before the damming of the reservoir and the pumping of the water. But I think that initial settlement was for those reasons. But everybody past that also wanted to settle there, including these two remarkable women who decided to build a home there. One thing to notice also about Duchess Castle is the building stone in this one photo. Occasionally you see this building stone in gardens in Los Alamos. People in the old days used to go out with their pickup trucks and throw in a bunch of rocks and go home and line their gardens with these building stones. This is a long time-honored tradition in New Mexico, salvaging building materials. And the women at Duchess Castle, using workmen, builders from San Ildefonso, they robbed this building that archaeologists refer to as Duchess Castle. But in reality, it's the sister village to Sanqui. It's a 55-room pueblo that was robbed for building stone to build Duchess Castle. This occurred about 1916. We took tree ring dates from those lintels you see at Duchess Castle, and the tree ring lab did bring them back at 1916. And you remember I was speaking of the complexity of Duchess Castle. Right at the point, that's where the location is of this little coalition village. It's a 10-room pueblo with a one kiva. It's very ephemeral, probably wasn't occupied more than a generation, which was typical of the coalition period sites on the plateau. Right, its location, Los Alamos Canyon, right to the north of it.
Once it was abandoned,
That one village, the 55-room pueblo of Duchess Castle, also known as LA 42. LA stands for Laboratory of Anthropology, not Los Alamos, but it has a very low number. Today there's probably over 200,000 archaeological sites in the LA series. But this one, LA 42, the number was assigned by a man named Mara, and the low number indicates that he thought it was a very important site, and it is, based on the pottery that's found there. So this, did this go off? No. This 55-room pueblo, the building stone ends over here at Duchess Castle. Then other structures are constructed. These are poured concrete foundations, a cistern. There's another house. Oops. Located in the trees right there, and an orno. Photo taken 1916. Shows how nice a complex these have. I like the caption of this photograph. This is out of a Forest Service manual and talks about the summer home that was built there. Kit and JJ are going to talk about actually what happened at this site. And what to look at, there's what we call Duchess Castle. This structure, that structure, are both adobe brick construction. And the only thing that remains of those are the foundations, the adobe bricks. I don't know if they're just melted or if they're robbed. This one photo, the last photo that I have of Duchess Castle, just shows the environmental change that has gone on at the site. Particularly if you look at the slope behind it, you can still walk up that slope and see that the skeletons of the big ponderosas that used to grow there are no longer there. I mean, the skeletons are there, but the trees are all dead. So you can go up and see the change there. But you can see that this one house, if you look at that complex of buildings, and if this property was in Santa Fe, you're talking $500,000, $750,000 property. But why is this building there? And from there, I'm going to, is it JJ? You're next. JJ will tell you about why it was built.
But before I tell you about why it was built, I'm going to tell you a little bit about one of the two women, the older woman, the Russian named Vera von Blumenthal. Let me get my slides up here. It'll take me a minute to find them. Okay, is this better?
Yes.
I may need some help, Casey. Slideshow, presenter view, let's try that. There we go. Okay, so as Rory mentioned, this was one of the houses that was adobe, not the stones from the sister pueblo of San Luis. And the vertical structures there were to provide a shaded area for the San Ildefonso potters who came later. But first we're going to talk a little bit about the women, and one of the first questions that Kit and I had when we started researching this subject. Why is this place called Duchess Castle? Somebody may have thought that the ruins resembled the ruins of a castle somewhere they saw once upon a time in Europe when they were looking at it from atop San Luis Mesa. I don't see the resemblance at all. The next thing Kit and I found out is that as far as we know, these women were not duchesses. Certainly Rose Dugan, an American, was not a duchess. And Vera didn't use any specific titles in her name when she wrote or was interviewed by the media. She preferred, it seemed, the title just Madam. So the only thing I could possibly find that got in the Duchess connection was that there was a Grand Duchess, a Russian Grand Duchess named Vera Konstantinov, who was alive about the time that our Vera von Blumenthal was around. Maybe someone somewhere had heard about this Grand Duchess and the first names being the same. Of course, there was no internet back then to do the research that Kit and I were able to do. So they put 2 and 2 together and came up with Duchess Castle. But one thing that we did find that was interesting is that we found no references to the words Duchess Castle in relation to this site in New Mexico until the late 1950s. And that was in a Los Alamos Laboratory publication, Community News. So my guess is now that maybe it was someone working on the Manhattan Project, poking around in the environment and visiting Sankowi Mesa, who dubbed this place Duchess Castle. We may never know. If any of you have any inside information, we'd love to hear it. So the women, of course, were gone by the time this place got that name. It was originally referred to as the fort in some Santa Fe, New Mexican newspaper articles. So let's talk a little bit about the woman named Vera Xenofontovna Kalamatiano de Blumenthal. Now, isn't that a mouthful? That wouldn't fit on a Social Security card or a Medicare card, I can tell you, because my name doesn't even fit on one. Well, who was this woman with all these names? She was born in 1864 in the Crimea, which was at that time part of the Russian Empire, in Sebastopol. Her father was an admiral and likely fought in the Crimean War. When Vera turned 17, she married a Greek trader named Dmitri Kalamatiano, hence the names Vera Xenofontovna, her birth name, Kalamatiano, her first married name. Well, when about a year after they were married, they were living in Vienna, and they had their son, and they named the poor child Xenophon after her maiden name. At least he probably didn't have any classmates with the same name, so he didn't have to worry about that. And he eventually got the nickname Zeno, which is almost as bad, I think. I wonder what kind of nicknames bullies came up with for him. Anyway, about 12 years after Zeno was born, Dmitri died, and soon thereafter Vera remarried. This time she married a Russian who had recently graduated from the St. Petersburg Law School. His name, Konstantin Paul de Blumenthal, hence Vera de Blumenthal, later Vera von Blumenthal. And we'll talk about that change a little bit later. So, we couldn't find any photos for a long time of Vera. So we looked at her passport application to find out what she looked like. She was a naturalized citizen, first of all, and was basically petite or short in stature and long in proboscis. So I figured maybe we were related. So this was an oil painting, a portrait that we found online. I think it may have been on an eBay and a couple of art auction sites. And at first I wasn't sure whether or not to believe the handwriting on the back of the portrait, which says, Vera von Blumenthal descended from Peter the Great of Russia. But after checking her passport description, she does sort of have an olive green complexion there. The long nose certainly is prominent, the high forehead. We don't know when this was painted. It was probably later in life. And though we still don't believe that necessarily that she is a descendant of Peter the Great, however. I have read, did write a book, a history about Peter the Great, but we're going to have to dig a lot deeper into her family roots to be able to confirm or deny that claim that she was related to him. This is how some other people have described Vera in various articles. She was a promoter of downtrodden women, their arts and handicrafts. She herself may have been an accomplished needleworker. She was an author and a translator, an eccentric entrepreneur, a philanthropist, a tiny noblewoman, a beauty and a flirt. And some people even claim that she was a spy for Russia. But in an interesting turn of fate and events, it turns out that is false. But it is true that her son Zeno later went on to become an American spy. He was called actually the first American spy in Russia by some authors. Unfortunately, we don't have time tonight to tell that fascinating story. That may come in one of the History Society publications. Vera's husband, Konstantin Paul de Blumenthal, was born in 1865 in Ryazan, Russia, which is about 100 miles southeast of Moscow. He described himself on his passport application basically as tall, light, and handsome, although in this old photo he certainly looks tall, dark, and maybe handsome. It's hard to tell. Finding photos of these people were difficult, and the photos we found were very poor quality. I have to apologize for that. Anyway, other people described de Blumenthal as a hopeless liberal romantic, a real-life Dr. Zhivago, and his wife Vera actually at one point describes him as being absolutely honest and generous to a fault. So why did the couple and their son come to America from Russia? Well, after Constantine publicly spoke out about the need for the Tsar to limit his powers, he decided it was in his best interest and that of his family to get out of the country. So he came here in 1895, and about a year later, Vera and her son Zeno came here. This is a photograph of Zeno taken 15 to 20 years after they immigrated. He was just a teenager when they came here. But Vera always had wanted her only son, her only child, to have an American education. And it turns out that her husband, Constantine, had a brother who worked at the consulate office in Chicago, Illinois. So that's where they first came. Soon thereafter, they moved to Indiana, where now Captain de Blumenthal, that was the title given to the teachers at the Culver Military Academy, where he taught Spanish, French, and German. He actually was fluent in 12 languages, I have read. Zeno attended school there, was a track star, and graduated at the end of the century with honors. Then he went on to the University of Chicago on a scholarship. And shortly after that, his parents headed west. They didn't want him moving back home again, I guess. Once the de Blumenthals got to California, Vera continued to work as a translator and a writer, while Mr. de Blumenthal once again taught foreign languages at a military school, this time the Harvard Military Academy in Los Angeles. They both spoke at various gatherings around Pasadena and Los Angeles, where Vera continued to exhibit and sell Russian handicrafts, primarily lace, but several other things as well. And her husband got involved with a group of Russian religious exiles. They were frequently mentioned in the society pages of the Pasadena and the Los Angeles newspapers. And in 1903, Vera's translations of a collection of Russian folk tales were published. And in the introduction to that book, Vera wrote, in her somewhat ornate language, "The work of tracing and gathering the last inheritance of the past must be done quickly before the rising tide of modern civilization submerges and effaces the old." In a way, that one sentence pretty much sums up what Vera ended up doing for her life work. She was trying to capture the dying arts and crafts of native and other native to her home in Russia and native to her new home here in America, trying to capture those dying arts and crafts before they were replaced by modernization, by quick-made, factory-produced goods. So almost every time Vera held a lace exhibit or her husband talked about conditions in Russia, they popped up in what was called the social diary and gossip section, or the society page. Life was going pretty well in California. Things were good. But then the de Blumenthals went from the gossip pages to the front pages. Constantine had worked with some other colleagues for about 2 years with those Russian religious colonists. They were trying to get land to farm and have animals on in Baja California in Mexico. And de Blumenthal probably used some of his old legal skills to help with that process. But when the payments finally became due for that land, the money wasn't there. They hadn't grown enough crops or raised enough animals, and de Blumenthal vanished from the area. There were rumors that he had committed suicide. Other rumors were that he was murdered. So naturally, his wife Vera was pretty distraught with all this news. She didn't know what had happened to her husband. Some of her friends thought she might have a nervous breakdown or worse, commit suicide. But a few months later, Vera finally got a letter from her husband, who was then back in Russia. So she decided to hold an extended interview with a reporter from the local paper. And in that interview, she said, "I do not know whether he will come back as he says or not. I expect to go ahead with my plans for the Russians, the Russian artisans, like the lace makers, not the Russian religious exiles that her husband was involved with. If my husband comes back, he will join me and all will be well. If he does not, well, I have my life work to do and I shall go on with it as I have planned." She no longer sounds like the distraught maiden. She sounds like a determined woman with a mission. So he didn't come back until 1923. By that time, they got divorced, separated, or whatever they called it. We couldn't find an official divorce record. But Vera did continue with her life work, and all in all, she exhibited and sold Russian handicrafts for more than 30 years throughout the United States, particularly in the LA and Pasadena area. And she also exhibited at 2 large expos in California. At the one in San Francisco, she won a first place award for her exhibit. But the one that's of most interest to us is the big Pan American exhibition done to celebrate the building of the Panama Canal, the completion of the Panama Canal. And at the San Diego exhibit, we have potters Maria and Julian Martinez, and archaeologists, anthropologists Edgar Hewitt and Jess Nussbaum. And although the expos didn't occur until 1915 and 1916, a lot of work was being done as early as 1914. So, Since Vera was exhibiting Russian handicrafts in San Diego at that same expo at the nearby Foreign Arts Building, I'm guessing that she probably stopped by and watched the potters and talked to them, maybe even met Hewitt and Nussbaum, and that may have been what attracted her to the Southwest. Also about this time, I keep pushing the wrong button, sorry. We've got problems leading up to World War I and the Bolshevik Revolution going on in Europe. So likely Vera was having a difficult time to get back there to visit and bring back some of those handicrafts that she was selling. So she was probably also around this time looking for another place to help downtrodden women renew their handicrafts and help them out financially and help herself out a little bit financially as well. Although most of the articles did say she only made a few cents on the dollar, just enough to cover her expenses. We do know that by late 1914, Vera von Blumenthal, and now Vera von Blumenthal, as you can see by the signature on the homestead application, I think she's trying to further distance herself from her ex-husband at this point. Well, in October, Rose and Vera both individually applied to the Forest Service for homesteads on the Pajarito Plateau. Each one would be 160 acre. Unfortunately, those applications were rejected because they did not fit the homestead requirement. The land was not suitable for agriculture. However, they ended up leasing the land from the Forest Service that is now the site of the Duchess Castle ruins. Vera developed this method that she was very successful at. The secret to her success, both with Russian handicrafts and later with the Native American potters, was to select one or more of the best pieces from an artisan, to pay an extra 25 to 50% above the market price for those items, and to encourage the artists and artisans to spend a little more time and effort to continue to improve their quality. That particular secret to her success became known as the von Blumenthal Dugan project. And Kit is going to tell us a little bit more about that in a minute. But I started off with a question that we still had not quite fully answered, and I'm going to end with a question that we still don't know the answer to. And that is, where and when did Vera von Blumenthal and Rose Dugan meet? We know they must have met by late 1914. They both stayed at various times at the St. Vincent Sanatorium in Santa Fe, and we believe that they stayed as guests rather than patients, though we haven't been able to confirm that. They both traveled extensively, so they could have met on a ship halfway around the world, but they also both lived in Indiana and California around the same times. And although we still don't know exactly where and when they met, we do know that they did eventually team up and made their mark on the history of New Mexico. So next, Kit is going to tell us about Rose Dugan.
Okay, all right. Rose Dugan was born in Richmond, Indiana in 1882. She was about 20 years younger than Vera von Blumenthal. She came from a wealthy family. She was well-traveled, cultured, and had attended a Quaker college. All her life, people described her as generous, open-minded, and unconventional. She was a pilot, an early pilot. That's Rose in her airplane. She learned to fly at the Wright Brothers School in Indiana. And jumping ahead a little bit, in 1918, when she was here in New Mexico, she decided she wanted, when the Americans entered World War I, she tried to volunteer to fly armored aircraft in France. She wanted to go get certified to do that, but the military had other ideas, so she came back to New Mexico. The first traces we have of Rose in New Mexico are from 3 Santa Fe, New Mexican articles. The first one was from 1898. She was 16 years old. She and her older sister visited the Hopi villages in Arizona, and then later they came back and the paper reported they'd been out to San Ildefonso. At San Ildefonso was living Maria Martinez, the to-be famed potter. At that time, she was 16 years old. Jumping ahead, in 1916, there were 2 more articles in the New Mexican. By now, Rose was 34. The first one was a short article announcing a Boy Scout meeting that night. Scouts were to show up on time and in uniform to hear Rose Dugan talk about aviation, signed A.J. Connell. And of course, A.J. Connell, shortly after that, became the first director of the Los Alamos Ranch School. Also in 1916, the newspaper reported that somebody flew over the city of Santa Fe in an airplane for the first time ever. The plane was flying so high they couldn't tell who it was, but it was rumored that it was Rose Dugan going to St. Louis, and indeed it was. By 1916, Von Blumenthal and Dugan had teamed up, and they wanted to start a project to make a contribution. So what did they want to accomplish? In those days, the Santa Fe, what I would call cultural community, for short, I'm going to say museum, but it involves the people at the Museum of New Mexico, the people at the School for American Research, SAR at the time, and others. But to be quick, I'm going to say just the museum. All these people were worried that the pottery, the traditional pottery of the Pueblos was going to die out. And so it actually became something of a cause in Santa Fe for about 20 years. Now, the narrative we've heard, maybe some of us, over the years, was that it took Anglo people to come in and save the pottery tradition at the Pueblos. Well, we're going to see about that in a minute. But part of the problem with the pottery was that when the railroads came in, tourists came too, which was good, but they started buying a lot of cheap, inexpensive, crudely made pottery curios for mementos. And the museum people did not like this. They thought it was not good. And so they did not like the candlesticks, ashtrays, and the worst thing of all was fake rain gods. Here we have a Tsuki woman from 1914 photograph making fake rain gods. I don't know, I sort of would like to have one myself. I think they're kind of cool. Sometimes they were sold by the barrel loads, apparently, at the train depots and places like that. But it's true the Pueblo women could not really earn well making this kind of stuff for tourists. So von Blumenthal and Dugan wanted to apply, did we just lose? No. Wanted to apply,
You stand there.
wanted to apply, okay. The method she had used on lace to try to encourage the development of high-quality pottery that would be attractive to well-off tourists and collectors. So that would increase the earnings for the potters, time and skill. They also wanted to develop a national market, and they had some experience doing that, especially von Blumenthal. To do this, they wanted to hold open house or studio, where they did not ever intend to teach, what's going on here? To teach Native people to make pottery. Von Blumenthal did not teach people to make pottery. Can you hear? Okay. Their focus was to act more like an art gallery owner would now, to coach, to say what's going to sell, what's going to make a good profit. And they were also going to only operate in the summer months. Why did they want to do this at Sankowi? Well, it was only 8 miles from San Ildefonso Pueblo, and there were clay deposits nearby. Rory told us about this. If you're driving up 502 up this way from Totavi, and you get to the twin water tanks, right to your right on the north side of the road, you can see clay deposits there. So that was part of the appeal. And then there were water sources, apparently, but we can't pin down who's right about what the water came from. One person says it was a spring there. One person says they must have caught runoff from Sankowi Mesa, and another person says there was water flowing in Los Alamos Canyon in those days, and they could have used that. We don't know yet. But to me, the interesting thing is, while all this concern in Santa Fe was going on about the threat of the die-out of Pueblo pottery, something really important was happening at the Pueblo at the very same time. That's a photo of Maria and Julian Martinez firing pots in 1916. They were well underway. They did have, they were not only making traditional pottery, but they were inventing new forms, new finishes, new designs. They had some connection with the museum people who were providing encouragement and some support, but they were very much doing things on their own terms. If you go down to Santa Fe right now to Museum Hill, there's a wonderful exhibit on San Ildefonso pottery. It's got a different perspective. The curators point out, among other things, that 60 years before this photo would have been taken, a potter at the Pueblo named Yellowdeer and others began a pottery revival that was still going on at the time of Maria and Julian and the museum people. The exhibit acknowledges the support from the museum, but it also places the events of 100 years ago when Maria and Julian were working in a very long continuum of revival, change, adaptation to change, innovation, and revival again in the pottery efforts over 400 years. So it's a very interesting counter-narrative to what maybe some of us thought, that the museum people came and helped the potters and changed everything. Maybe they did a little. So that's something to go and see. Maria Martinez did know these women. And she told an interviewer, one was young and one was old. They had a ranch out there on the Sankowi. They would have open house, and I made a big one, and she gave me $7 for that pot. What we don't know, though, is whether Maria actually ever went to Duchess Castle. We don't know where these transactions happened. And in fact, not very many potters did ever come to the open houses. And so that was a disappointment. And so after only 3 summers, they were only open in the summers, they decided to pack it up. The same year, Dugan's father died and she had to go back to Indiana for family responsibilities. By then, von Blumenthal had started to sell pottery in her studio in Pasadena, so perhaps some of her goals had been met. And as you heard the year before, her son had been arrested in Russia and sentenced to death for being a spy, so she may have wanted to stay in California where she could get news quicker. But also in 1919, water may have become a problem. You remember Lawrence Hitchcock, who was a master at the Los Alamos Ranch School. He wrote down his memories of that time and place. And he said that in 1919, that might have been the last year water was flowing in Los Alamos Canyon. And he acknowledged that would have been a bad problem for the women there. So they decided to pack it in, but they did something pretty interesting just before that. They went down to the museum and they offered to turn over their project to Hewitt. This is a picture of Kenneth Chapman at that time. Chapman was an artist himself and a museum official, and he had long wanted to establish a pottery collection, a big one, a better one, that would span all the eras, all the different types. But he wasn't getting anywhere with that. Hewitt wasn't interested. Hewitt was doing more like excavations and things. So at the SAR library, we were able to see first draft copies of Kenneth Chapman's memoirs in his handwriting. And we were really struck by his enthusiasm when he described what he felt like when the women came to turn over this project to him. He wrote, actually, there was very little doing in Indian art at the time. He said there were no funds for purchasing arts and crafts and no prospect of any. And then suddenly, he said, the picture changed. Madame von Blumenthal gave us the secret of her success, and Dugan gave us ample funds, only 200 in those days, to implement the plan, and he called it the first real encouragement he had ever had for that. Later, he called it the magic formula. $200 in those days would have been maybe between $1,300 and $1,400 now. Still not so much, but it made a difference. So one of the first potters that Chapman tried the magic formula on was Tonita Roybal. She was also from San Ildefonso. She had been going around Santa Fe, door to door, trying to sell her pottery and was getting no luck at all. So Chapman picked her best pot that he thought was best. He gave her 50% more than she was asking, and he told her to go back and take more time with her next work and see what she could come up with. And he wrote that within 3 months, she had ready sales at 3 times the price she had been asking. And then you can be sure the news really got back fast to the Pueblo about how that worked. And this is a picture of Tonita maybe 10 or 15 years later. Tonita Roybal became a revered potter. These are 2 of her jars. They are currently in the SAR collection. SAR was very kind to send us these photos. What's nice about this is that these two jars plus 3 other pots by other artists form a set of pots that were donated to SAR in 1924 by Rose Dugan. So after they closed up Duchess Castle, after 1919, Rose Dugan occasionally came back to Santa Fe. She continued all during the 20s to write to Hewitt, Chapman, and other museum officials. It's kind of fun to read some of those letters. She lived in her various homes in Denver, California, and Richmond, Indiana. For a while, for a couple of decades, she settled off and on in Palm Springs, California. where she was a close friend of Dr. Florilla White, who was a physician there and a founding member of that community. And Rose Dugan died in Palm Springs in 1960 at age 78. But back to Santa Fe in 1922. The museum and others held the first Indian fair. And you can see by this photograph, Indian fairs in those days were held indoors in the old armory building, National Guard Armory building that used to stand by the Palace of the Governors. Dugan, in 1922, donated $1,000 bond. She directed that the interest would be used for prize money every year for the fairs. And Kenneth Chapman wrote that Rose Dugan, the Indian fair was set in motion by the contribution from Rose Dugan, that once she donated, others followed suit. The scholar, Bruce Bernstein, he wrote about this, that it was Kenneth Chapman who worked with the potters and painters to create the arts and crafts that made the first Indian fair an instant success. So you can see the progression. And so what would be the next huge progression from Indian fair? Indian market, right? This picture doesn't do justice to the crowds, right? So for 2018, there were 115,000 visitors buying from 1,000 artists. Over 3 days, $165 million were generated for northern New Mexico. It's estimated that many artists make a third to half of their annual salary at market. And we all know it sprawls all over downtown Santa Fe during those days. But it is a terrific thing. So we've streamlined this and it's quick, but in closing, I will say that the legacy of Duchess Castle and the women, at Sankowe, the Duchess Castle project really didn't have much effect on Pueblo pottery. They were only there in the summers. It didn't really click. But when von Blumenthal handed over her magic formula and Dugan contributed money, you could say it served as an ignition key and fuel to start up a dormant vehicle at the machine, and Kenneth Chapman and others could move ahead, and they did. Thank you, and thank you to all the people who helped us.
If there are questions, I can pass the mic around. I can even run up the stairs.
So what was the maximum population of the Pueblo area around here?
The question was maximum Pueblo population.
The maximum.
That's a very good question. I cannot answer it. I can give you figures from other people, but it's mostly a guess. I think Charlie Steen, he talks about 10,000 people on the plateau from Cochiti up to Pouillet. And I think that's high. I would hesitate to, I'll give you a number, maybe 5,000.
I don't need a mic, I'm pretty loud. It's kind of scary in here. For Rory, you talked about how the Pueblo people helped build the Duchess Castle with stones from the previous ruin. So, were the Pueblo people good with that? That was okay? Was it, was there any sort of strife there? How did that work?
I don't know if there was strife or not. We view preservation differently today than they did back in 1916. I used to work with a gentleman at Bandelier. His name is Gary Roy, but I don't think he'd mind me giving out his name. But his grandfather was very well known as being an adobe mason, and he was often hired out to build houses. Evidently, and please correct me, that the workmen they hired were all from San Ildefonso.
Right, and would include Tilano. The workmen who built the walls at Duchess Castle included Tilano Montoya. He was the Tilano who lived with Edith Warner at Ottawa in later years. And they also included Crescencio Martinez. If I had more time, I would have talked about Crescencio Martinez in 1916, along with the Martinez's, fabulous artist. You'll read about him if you go to the show down at Museum Hill. But he and others, when you see those walls, you think of those hands. Okay. Is there someone else?
Thank you all three for your presentation. It was very interesting. My question is about the original forest land. How did the government acquire the original land where Sankaway is?
I would like to give that question to Mike Bremer or Ann Baldwin, who just recently both retired from the Forest Service. I'm not sure how the establishment of Santa Fe National Forest occurred. Was it General Land Office properties? I'm not sure. Mike, do you want to take a stab at it? Ann, do you want to take a stab?
It's originally reclaimed land, so it's part of the original set aside of the forest. So it was open government. It was considered open government land, and then when the forest reserve was set aside for the Hamas Forest Reserve in 1905, I believe, was when it came into the Forest Service. But prior to that time, it was just general government land. Yeah, probably. At that time, the government didn't do a lot of asking.
Is there another question? Jim?
This is a question for Rory. Do you know much about the petroglyph of the conquistador as far as a date goes? And anything more about it?
Well, I have my own interpretation about it. Of course, it dates to the historic period with the horse being depicted in it. I like to think it occurred either during the initial settlement of the Rio Grande Valley, sometime around 1600, or just simply that the horse is oversized in that petroglyph to the human that's on top of it. And to me, if you had not seen a horse before and a rider, I think the horse would probably really impress you in the size. And also with him waving his sword in the air, to me, I'm guessing sometime between 1600 and 1680, Pueblo Revolt period.
Thank you.
Thanks.
Thank you. Thank you all for coming. Thank you, speakers. It was fantastic. It was wonderful to hear the stories that went along with the hike that I went on. So it was great. So thank you all for coming. Next month should be a real treat too. So come back.